Beneath the history we were taught lies a story almost entirely forgotten. While Europe slept through what we call the Dark Ages, knowledge flourished in hidden corners of the world. Monks in remote monasteries, scholars in Baghdad, secret brotherhoods in shadowed halls, all safeguarded discoveries that empires and churches sought to bury. The Knights Templar protected sacred texts, Islamic scholars preserved and expanded ancient wisdom, and clandestine codices carried secrets of the stars, medicine, and mathematics across continents. These guardians of knowledge ensured that humanity's brilliance survived, even as wars, plagues, and power struggles threatened to erase it forever. Welcome to Mysteries of Earth, where we uncover the truths that history tried to hide. Like, share, and subscribe, and journey with us as we reveal the secrets of the Dark Ages, forgotten civilizations, and the protectors of knowledge through time. For centuries, we've been told a story, one that divides history into light and darkness. The light belonged to Rome, with its grand architecture, its poets, its law, its reason. And then, so the tale goes, came the fall. 1,000 years of ignorance, superstition, and decay. The Dark Ages. But what if that story was never true? The term itself was born not in the Middle Ages, but during the Renaissance, an age eager to glorify its own rebirth by painting the centuries before it in shadow. The scholars of Florence and Venice, seeking to elevate their rediscovered Greek and Roman heritage, dismissed everything in between as barbaric and blind. And yet, behind that convenient myth, history tells a different story, one of quiet brilliance, resilience, and transformation. When Rome fell in the 5th century, it did not vanish overnight. Its knowledge scattered, not destroyed, but carried along the arteries of trade, across deserts and seas, through the memories of monks, the libraries of Byzantium, and the schools of Baghdad. The empire's fall was not the death of civilization, but its metamorphosis. Europe was changing, yes, but in ways few modern textbooks ever acknowledge. The so-called Dark Ages saw the birth of universities, the spread of written languages, and the preservation of ancient science. Farmers developed crop rotations that would feed generations. Artisans built cathedrals whose designs still baffle engineers today. And in remote monasteries, scribes worked tirelessly, copying texts from Aristotle to Galen, unaware that their efforts would one day rebuild the very world they lived in. So why then did history brand them as dark? Because darkness is a matter of perception. It depends on who holds the torch, and who decides where its light falls. The church, the conquerors, the chroniclers of empires. Each shaped the narrative to fit their needs. Knowledge that didn't serve their power was hidden, condemned, or quietly rewritten. Yet beneath that imposed silence, humanity never stopped searching. The seeds of modern thought, of science, philosophy, and discovery were already taking root in this so-called age of ignorance. The invention of the mechanical clock, the rise of Gothic architecture, the first stirrings of astronomy beyond the sphere of faith, all of it began here. What if the Dark Ages were not an age of darkness at all, but a long, turbulent dawn, a time when humanity was still learning to see itself anew, to rebuild its foundations after the collapse of empire? Perhaps it is easier to label 1,000 years as lost than to admit that we do not yet understand them. Easier to call them dark than to face the uncomfortable truth that even in our brightest ages, much of history remains hidden in shadow, shaped by those who decide what is remembered and what is forgot. And the Dark Ages were never truly dark. They were simply unseen. And now, their light is finally the fall of Rome. Few moments in history have been painted with such finality. One empire, once stretching from the Atlantic to the deserts of Arabia, suddenly collapsing into chaos. But history is rarely that simple. Empires don't fall overnight. They fade, they fracture, and in their ruins, something new is always born. In the 5th century, the eternal city that once ruled the known world began to crumble under its own weight. Centuries of corruption, endless wars, and reliance on slave labor had hollowed it from within. The legions that once marched in perfect discipline now served foreign generals. The roads that bound Europe began to crumble, and the heartbeat of trade slowed to silence. Then came the invasions. The Visigoths, the Vandals, the Ostrogoths. To the Romans, they were barbarians, wild tribes at the edge of civilization. Yet, to many of these so-called barbarians, Rome was not an enemy to destroy, but a dream to inherit. They admired its laws, its art, its language. And when they entered its gates, they did not come only with swords, but with visions of their own future. Still, for those who lived through it, the fall felt like the end of the world. The aqueducts dried, the markets emptied, and the idea of empire, of unity, shattered. Libraries were looted. Temples fell silent. The voice of reason that had once echoed through marble halls was replaced by whispers of faith and fear. Yet even in collapse, the seeds of rebirth were taking root. As Roman order disintegrated, local tribes began to carve out their own kingdoms, each blending the remnants of the old world with their own traditions. The Franks, the Saxons, the Lombards, they would lay the foundations for nations that still exist today. Rome's death was not a descent into chaos, but a transformation, a migration of ideas from empire to earth, from marble to soil. But to those in the CE, centuries that followed, it was easier to call it darkness. The grandeur of Rome had become legend, and legends cast long shadows. The Church rose to fill the void left by the empire, becoming not just the keeper of faith, but of knowledge, power, and time itself. And so, a new order emerged, one not of emperors and philosophers, but of priests and kings. The torch of civilization passed hands, but its light dimmed under layers of control. Science became heresy. Curiosity became sin. History, once written in the open, now lived in whispers. Yet, hidden in the ruins of Rome, something persisted. Fragments of law, art, and philosophy that refused to die. The barbarians who settled its lands built upon its bones, not realizing they were rekindling the fire they were said to have extinguished. So, was it truly the end of civilization, or merely the end of one illusion, the illusion that empire and enlightenment are the same? In the ashes of Rome's fall, humanity began again, raw, uncertain, and unshackled from the weight of empire. And though the night ahead would be long, within it glimmered the first sparks of something extraordinary, the beginning of a new world, born not from Rome's perfection, but from its ruins. When the Roman Empire collapsed, it left behind a void, not just of power but of meaning. Cities lay in ruins, roads overgrown, and the old gods had fallen silent. In that silence, one institution stepped forward to claim the soul of Europe, the Church. It promised order where chaos reigned, salvation where hope had vanished. Yet in uniting the shattered world under the banner of faith, the Church became something far greater and far more powerful than a spiritual refuge. It became the architect of time itself. In the centuries that followed Rome's fall, the Church decided when history began and when it ended. The old pagan calendars, once tied to the cycles of nature and the stars, were replaced with the Christian reckoning, years now measured from the birth of Christ. The past, the present, and the future were rewritten in sacred ink. But it didn't stop there. The Church controlled not just the measure of time, but the measure of truth. In monasteries across Europe, monks became the custodians of knowledge, copying texts, translating scriptures, and deciding which ideas deserved to survive. What didn't align with divine doctrine was erased, labelled heresy, or hidden away in locked chambers, never meant to be read again. Ancient scientific treatises, philosophical works, and histories of the old world were quietly suppressed. The wisdom of Greece, Rome, and Egypt was now filtered through a single lens: faith. To question the Church's word was to question God himself. Yet this immense control came with paradox. In seeking to preserve divine truth, the Church inadvertently became the preserver of civilization itself. The same monasteries that censored pagan writings also saved fragments of Aristotle, Galen, and Ptolemy, texts that would later spark the rebirth of science centuries after. Still, beneath the cathedrals and sermons, a silent transformation was too taking place. The Church's power extended beyond religion. It shaped kings, laws, and even the way people thought about the world. The earth was no longer a sphere in motion, but a flat plane beneath the heavens. Disease was not biology, but sin. Lightning was not natural, but divine wrath. And time itself was sanctified. Bells tolled not for the hours of the sun, but for the prayers of man. Life moved according to divine rhythm, each day measured not by stars, but by Scripture. But power built on belief is fragile. The more tightly truth was held, the more it invited doubt. Across Europe, quiet voices began to rise. Scholars, alchemists, and travelers who saw the world differently. They whispered of ancient knowledge, of forgotten sciences, of truths buried beneath centuries of control. The Church could silence men, but not ideas. And so, the very institution that defined time and truth for an age would one day face the inevitable, the reawakening of the human spirit it had sought to contain. For truth, no matter how deeply buried, always finds its way back to the light. There are few tragedies in human history as haunting as the burning of the Library of Alexandria, a fire that consumed not just paper and ink, but the very memory of civilization. In that ancient city by the Mediterranean, knowledge was once worshipped as divine. Built under the reign of the Ptolemies, the Library of Alexandria was more than a collection of scrolls. It was humanity's first great university, a sanctuary for the mind. Scholars from Greece, Egypt, Persia, and India gathered beneath its marble columns to exchange ideas, debate the cosmos, and seek the origins of life itself. It was said that every ship arriving at the city's harbour was searched, and any scrolls found on board were copied and added to its vast archive, a growing reflection of all that humanity had ever known. But one day, that light went out. The flames that engulfed Alexandria were not a single event, but a slow erasure stretched across centuries. War, conquest, and zealotry each took their turn. First came Julius Caesar's siege in 48 BCE, when fire spread from the docks to the great storehouses of scrolls. Then, centuries later, came religious conflicts, when pagan temples were destroyed and the pursuit of forbidden knowledge became heresy. By the time the dust settled, the greatest library ever built, the heart of the ancient world's intellect, had turned to ash. What was lost cannot be measured. Within those scrolls were the blueprints of forgotten technologies, maps of lands unseen, the mathematics of the stars, and philosophies that might have changed the destiny of humankind. Some historians believe early insights into electricity, flight, or even the motion of planets beyond Saturn may have rested there, centuries before modern science rediscovered them. But the true loss was not just knowledge, it was continuity. When Alexandria burned, so did the bridge between the ancients and the modern world. Humanity was forced to start again, to rebuild its understanding piece by fragile piece. And in that vacuum of wisdom, superstition found its throne. The guardians of faith who rose after the fall of Alexandria feared knowledge that could challenge divine authority. What had once been studied in open halls was now whispered in secrecy. The scientific became the mystical, the rational became the forbidden. Yet across generations, the legend of Alexandria endured, a symbol of both human brilliance and fragility. It whispered a warning that knowledge is the most precious treasure we possess, and also the most vulnerable. Even today, fragments of that lost library resurface in the most unexpected places. Translated texts in the sands of Egypt, half-burned scrolls found in forgotten caves, and quotations preserved by scholars who once walked its halls. Each discovery is a ghost from a civilization that dreamed too far ahead of its time. The burning of the Library of Alexandria was not merely the destruction of books. It was the silencing of voices. Voices that might have told us who we were and who we were meant to become. But though the flames took the scrolls, they could not extinguish the human hunger to know. That hunger would resurface, centuries later, in monasteries, in secret societies, and in the hands of those who refused to let knowledge die. For the fire that destroyed Alexandria may have burned the pages of our past, but it also lit a spark that would one day reignite the world. When the Western Roman Empire fell, the world believed civilization had ended. But far to the east, beyond the shattered borders of Europe, a different story was unfolding. One the West would one day try to forget. It was called Byzantium, an empire of marble and flame, a world where ancient wisdom was not buried, but reborn. In the golden glow of Constantinople, the city the Romans once called Nova Roma, the torch of civilization continued to burn. Its towering walls guarded not only a city, but an idea, that knowledge, art, and faith could coexist in balance. While Europe descended into chaos, Byzantium became the bridge between worlds, East and West, pagan past and Christian future, science and spirit. Its scholars still read Aristotle. Its mathematicians refined geometry and astronomy. Its architects built domes that defied gravity, crowned by the legendary Hagia Sophia, a cathedral so magnificent that it seemed to touch the heavens themselves. Its diplomats wrote in Greek, its priests chanted in Latin, and its artists painted visions of eternity in gold and lapis. In every sense, Byzantium was not a shadow of Rome. It was its transformation. Yet history remembers it faintly, as if through the fog of deliberate forgetting. Western chronicles reduced it to a footnote, calling its people decadent, its art stagnant, its politics corrupt. But beneath those dismissive words lies a deeper truth, that Byzantium preserved what the West had lost. While kings in Europe fought over crowns and crusades, Byzantine scholars quietly copied and translated the great works of antiquity, the philosophies of Plato, the medicine of Galen, the histories of Herodotus. They safeguarded them for centuries, waiting for a future that might be ready to remember. And when that future came, during the Renaissance, it was Byzantine refugees who carried those lost manuscripts and to Italy after the fall of Constantinople in 1453. The rebirth of Europe, the Renaissance itself, was not born from nothing. It was the final gift of Byzantium, the empire of light the West never dared to credit. But the glory of Byzantium was not just in its books. It lived in its resilience. For over 1,000 years, it stood at the crossroads of empires, resisting Persians, Arabs, Crusaders, and Turks. It endured betrayal, siege, and fire. Yet it remained, century after century, a beacon of continuity in a world of collapse. And then, at last, it too fell. Not because it was weak, but because it was surrounded. The flames that consumed Constantinople in 1453 echoed the same tragic fire that once devoured Alexandria. Another library burned, another civilization vanished into myth. But the story of Byzantium did not die with its walls. It lives in every cathedral dome, every mosaic, every scientific manuscript that survived the centuries. Its spirit whispers through the Renaissance, through the Enlightenment, and even through our modern world. The forgotten empire of light may have vanished from maps, but not from memory. It remains a silent reminder that history's true brilliance often lies not in what survived, but in what the victors chose to forget. When the empires of men crumbled and cities fell silent, it seemed as if the light of knowledge had flickered out forever. Roads once filled with merchants and philosophers turned to dust. The great libraries were gone, and with them, the memory of the world. But far from the ruins, hidden in the misted valleys of Europe, a quiet resistance was taking shape, not with swords, but with ink and parchment. Within the stone walls of isolated monasteries, men in rough robes bent over candlelight. Hour after hour, day after day, they copied the fading words of the ancients, word by fragile word. To many, they were mere monks, but in truth, they were guardians of civilization itself. Their scriptoria, small silent rooms smelling of wax and vellum, became the secret arteries through which ancient wisdom continued to flow. Here, Homer's epics were reborn. Aristotle's reason found refuge. The mathematics of Pythagoras, the geometry of Euclid, and the philosophy of Plato were preserved, not for themselves, but for a future world that had forgotten how to dream. In an age when knowledge was seen as dangerous, these monks became its quiet protectors. They lived under vows of silence, humility, and obedience, yet what they carried between their hands was more powerful than any crown. With quill and ink, they bridged the broken line between antiquity and the Renaissance. But their work was not without peril. Many of the texts they copied were condemned as heretical. The Church, which had come to dominate not only faith but also thought, viewed certain pagan works as temptations, relics of a fallen world. Yet within those cloisters, some monks disobeyed. They hid scrolls behind false walls, buried manuscripts beneath chapel floors, and encoded forbidden ideas in their own writings. They were the hidden scholars, men who understood that the flame of knowledge must never die. Then, if it burned in secret, their work stretched across generations. A single book might take decades to complete, but they persisted, believing that truth, even when silenced, could never be destroyed. And when Europe finally began to awaken centuries later, it was their work that re-emerged from the shadows. The Renaissance thinkers who reshaped the modern world, Petrarch, Erasmus, Copernicus, all built upon the manuscripts that monks had once risked everything to preserve. These monasteries were not just places of prayer. They were time capsules, sanctuaries of memory in a world that had chosen to forget. Each illuminated page, adorned with gold and color, was an act of defiance against the darkness. History often calls them relics of superstition. Yet without them, the story of humanity would have vanished into silence. The hidden scholars of the monasteries proved that even in the darkest of ages, the human spirit could find a way to write its light into eternity. And so, when we speak of the Dark Ages, perhaps we should remember it was only dark to those who stopped looking. Deep within the walls of those monasteries, the stars of knowledge never ceased to shine. When Rome fell, the world was said to have plunged into chaos, a descent into darkness brought on by the fury of the barbarians. That is the story we were told, that civilization crumbled beneath the boots of wild tribes who burned libraries, sacked cities, and destroyed everything that made Rome great. But history, as it turns out, is rarely that simple. The so-called barbarians, Goths, Franks, Vandals, Lombards, Saxons, were not mere destroyers. They were wanderers, warriors, and survivors of collapsing worlds. They didn't come to erase Rome. They came to inherit it. When Roman order dissolved, it left behind something more valuable than empire: its knowledge, its law, its architecture, its sense of identity. And as these tribes moved across its ruins, they absorbed the fragments of that fading civilization. In their own ways, they began to rebuild what Rome had lost, not as imitators, but as architects of something new. In the forests of Gaul, the Franks built their first wooden fortresses atop Roman foundations. In Italy, the Ostrogoths adopted the Latin tongue and maintained Roman law. Even the Vandals, long vilified for their sack of Rome, preserved Roman engineering and governance in North Africa for nearly a century. It was not destruction they left behind. It was transformation. These so-called savages blended Roman tradition with their own tribal customs, forging the roots of what would one day become medieval Europe. The modern nations of France, Germany, and England trace their origins not to the Senate of Rome, but to the councils of chieftains and kings who once rode through its ashes. And their influence went far beyond politics. The barbarians brought with them a fierce sense of freedom, loyalty, and kinship. In their societies, law was personal, bound by honor and oath rather than decree. Power was not inherited through empire, but earned through strength and wisdom. They valued courage, not titles. Community, not hierarchy. Through this union, the disciplined structure of Rome and the raw vitality of the tribes, a new world began to emerge. Stone replaced timber. Kingdoms rose where tribes once camped. Churches stood where longhouses had been. And over generations, the barbarians ceased to be outsiders. They became the very heart of Europe. Even the word barbarian, born from Roman arrogance, began to lose its meaning. For in time, it was these tribes, the Franks under Charlemagne, the Anglo-Saxons in England, the Lombards in Italy, who rekindled learning, revived trade, and restored the fragile spark of civilization. They built roads again, carved cathedrals from stone, and sent their children to study in the same monasteries that had once hidden from their ancestors. They did not destroy Rome. They resurrected it in a new form. And so, what history once painted as an age of ruin was, in truth, an age of rebirth. The barbarians who were blamed for ending civilization were the very ones who carried its embers forward. From their courage and adaptation, the medieval world was born, a world that would one day give rise to the Renaissance, and beyond it, the modern age itself. The barbarians did not bring the darkness. They brought the dawn. As the embers of the ancient world dimmed, a new figure rose from the heart of Europe, a man who would be called the Father of the West. His name was Charlemagne. To his enemies, he was a conqueror. To his people, a savior. But history remembers him for something far greater, a silent rebirth of knowledge in an age the world thought was lost to darkness. The 8th century was a time when the memory of Rome still haunted Europe. Its grandeur lingered in ruins, its wisdom scattered in forgotten scrolls, its order replaced by chaos. Yet in this fragile landscape, Charlemagne, king of the Franks, saw a divine mission, to rebuild not just an empire, but the soul of civilization itself. His empire, stretching from the Pyrenees to the Danube, was more than a conquest of land. It was a conquest of ignorance. Charlemagne believed knowledge was the key to uniting his realm. But knowledge by then was a ghost. The old texts of Aristotle, Euclid, and Cicero lay buried in monasteries, guarded by monks who could barely read them. And so began what history would later call the Carolingian Renaissance, a secret revival that sought to bridge heaven and reason, faith and intellect. Charlemagne gathered scholars from across the known world to his court in Aachen. Among them was the English monk Alcuin of York, whose mind carried the remnants of classical learning. Under Charlemagne's protection, these men became the quiet torchbearers of Europe's forgotten brilliance. They copied ancient manuscripts by candlelight, standardized Latin grammar, and taught the sons of nobles to read and write, a skill that had nearly vanished from the West. The emperor himself could barely write his name, yet he would fall asleep with a tablet under his pillow, practicing his letters. For Charlemagne, learning was not a luxury. It was a form of worship. He saw knowledge as a divine light, a gift from God that had been squandered in centuries of war and superstition. But his Renaissance was not just intellectual. It was artistic, architectural, and spiritual. Inspired by the ruins of Rome, he built palaces with marble columns, crowned with arches that mirrored the grandeur of the ancients. His chapel in Aachen was modeled after the great churches of Ravenna and Constantinople, a fusion of Roman symmetry and Christian devotion. Under his rule, scribes invented a new form of handwriting, the Carolingian minuscule, clear, elegant, and uniform. It became the foundation of modern script, ensuring that ancient texts could be preserved and read by future generations. Yet this Renaissance was no rebellion against faith. It was a harmony of the sacred and the rational, a belief that reason itself was divine. Charlemagne's scholars sought to reconcile Plato with the Bible, Aristotle with the Church Fathers, creating a fragile bridge between the world of philosophy and theology. And though it would fade after his death, the seeds he planted would one day sprout again, in the universities of Paris, in the cathedrals of Chartres, in the minds of men who dared to question and seek. The so-called Dark Ages were never truly dark. In hidden halls and candle-lit monasteries, a king and his circle of thinkers reignited a flame that had nearly gone out, a flame that whispered, civilization had not died. It was only waiting to be reborn. Charlemagne's empire may have crumbled, but his vision endured. For in the shadows of his reign, Europe glimpsed the light of its own awakening. History remembers the Middle Ages as a time of superstition, an age when reason was silenced and science forgotten. Yet beneath the flickering light of oil lamps, in stone workshops and cloistered monasteries, a different story was unfolding, one of forgotten inventors, vanished machines, and a brilliance that seemed centuries ahead of its time. Here, in the shadows of medieval Europe, craftsmen and scholars defied the darkness. They built things the world wasn't ready to see, and for reasons still debated today, many of their creations disappeared from history. Among the first was the monk known as Gerbert of Aurillac, who would later become Pope Sylvester II. 1,000 years before the Enlightenment, Gerbert constructed mechanical clocks, astronomical spheres, and even a primitive calculating machine, a forerunner to the computer. His knowledge was so far beyond comprehension that the people of his age called it witchcraft. Some even claimed he had made a pact with the devil. When he died, much of his work was buried with him, his devices dismantled, his books hidden by those who feared their power. Then there were the mystery machines of Villard de Honnecourt, a 13th-century engineer who filled notebooks with designs that seemed to belong to another world, perpetual motion devices, flying machines, and robotic statues powered by hidden weights and pulleys. His sketches suggest a mind that understood mechanics centuries before Da Vinci, yet his workshop vanished, and his inventions left no trace beyond the pages of his journal. And what of Roger Bacon, the English friar who envisioned telescopes, microscopes, and engines powered by explosive powder long before such things existed? Bacon was imprisoned for heresy, his writings deemed dangerous, his ideas too threatening to the established order. Many of his works were lost, censored, or burned. These were no isolated geniuses. Across medieval Europe, in Moorish Spain, Byzantine Constantinople, and the Islamic world, hidden laboratories thrived. Alchemists mixed mercury and sulfur, seeking not only gold but transformation, the secret of matter itself. Physicians performed cataract surgeries with silver needles. Engineers built water-powered mills, pressure pumps, and even programmable automata that could serve drinks or play instruments. So why did so much of it vanish? Part of the answer lies in power. The Church, seeking to preserve its authority, tightly controlled knowledge. Anything that challenged divine order was seen as dangerous. Science could not coexist with faith unless it served it. The other part lies in time, wars, plagues, and the fragility of parchment. Entire libraries were burned, countless manuscripts lost to fire, invasion, or silence. Yet fragments survived. They whisper from forgotten codices and cryptic marginal notes, reminders that human curiosity never truly died. It only went underground. When we study the Renaissance, we often believe innovation suddenly bloomed. But in truth, it was a rediscovery, a reawakening of knowledge born in an age long before. Those vanished medieval minds had already walked paths that modern science would follow centuries later. So perhaps the Dark Ages weren't dark at all, just dimly lit by candles no one thought to notice. In those flickering shadows, men and women crafted wonders that defied belief. Machines that could move on their own. Medicines that healed before chemistry had a name. Ideas that glimpsed the machinery of the universe itself. And when their time passed, history buried them, not out of malice, but out of fear. For light too bright, in an age unready, can blind as easily as it can reveal. Their inventions vanished, but their spirit, the daring to question, to create, to seek, endured. Oh, and it is that spirit born in shadow that would one day ignite the world. It began, as many of history's greatest mysteries do, with a whisper, a sickness from the east, a ship docking in a quiet Sicilian harbour, rats scurrying through the night. And soon, death itself followed. By the mid-14th century, the world had changed beyond recognition. Towns fell silent, bells tolled endlessly, entire families vanished overnight. The Black Death, the deadliest pandemic in recorded history, had arrived. But as the bodies piled up and Europe descended into chaos, one question has never fully disappeared. Was the plague simply nature's wrath, or something far more deliberate? The official story tells of a bacterium, Yersinia pestis, spread by fleas on black rats, traveling along trade routes from Central Asia to Europe. Within 5 years, it wiped out nearly half the continent's population. Yet even now, historians and scientists debate its origins and its strangely precise patterns. Some chronicles from the era describe the plague appearing in multiple distant regions almost simultaneously, as if carried not by rats, but by unseen hands. Others spoke of wells poisoned, food stores tainted, and clouds of foul vapours drifting mysteriously over cities untouched by trade. Modern researchers have uncovered letters from the time suggesting that biological warfare was not unheard of. During the siege of Kaffa in 1346, Mongol armies reportedly catapulted plague-infected corpses over city walls, a chilling act of early germ warfare. From there, Genoese sailors fleeing the siege carried the infection to Italy, and the rest is history. But what if this act wasn't isolated? What if the Black Death was not just a weapon of war, but a tool of control? In the chaos that followed, entire social orders collapsed. The old world, feudal, rigid, unquestioning, cracked open. Labour became scarce, peasants demanded rights, and the Church's authority faltered as prayers failed to stop the dying. Monarchies weakened, economies imploded, and from the ashes new powers rose, those who controlled medicine, trade, and belief. To some historians, it is coincidence. To others, it marks the beginning of a transformation too perfectly aligned to be chance. Ancient texts and secret chronicles speak of groups who saw plague as purification, a way to reset the world, to cleanse it of impurity and ignorance. Whispers of secret orders, alchemists, mystics, and scholars who believed death was not an end, but a necessary evolution of civilization. And yet, what's most haunting is how the Black Death seemed to prepare the stage for what came next, the rebirth of Europe. Within decades, the Renaissance emerged. Science, art, and reason flourished, power consolidated. Could it be that out of unimaginable suffering, a select few found opportunity to rewrite society, to rebuild it in their image. Even today, geneticists studying medieval mass graves find traces of Yersinia pestis, strains that behave differently from modern ones, mutating faster, spreading faster, dying faster, almost as if engineered to burn bright and vanish. We may never know the full truth. Whether the Black Death was an accident of nature or an act of human intent remains one of history's most unsettling questions. But one thing is certain: it changed the balance of power forever. It silenced kings, humbled priests, and reminded humanity of its fragility. And in that silence, when fear ruled and faith trembled, the world was quietly remade. Perhaps the plague was both, tragedy and transformation, death and design. Because sometimes, to reshape the world, the old one must first be brought to it. While Europe lay in the shadow of its so-called Dark Ages, another world was awakening, luminous, curious, and unafraid to ask questions forbidden elsewhere. From the sands of Arabia to the palaces of Persia, a civilization rose that refused to let knowledge die. The Islamic world became the silent guardian of human understanding. In Baghdad, Damascus, Cordoba, and Cairo, scholars gathered in glittering halls lit by oil lamps and filled with the scent of parchment and ink. They pored over ancient scrolls rescued from Greece, Egypt, Persia, and India, texts that Europe had long forgotten or declared heretical. Here, in these sanctuaries of learning, translators and scientists began one of the greatest preservation projects in human history. They didn't merely copy ancient knowledge, they expanded it. Greek philosophy was reborn through Arabic tongues. Plato, Aristotle, Galen, and Ptolemy were not only remembered, they were questioned, debated, and reimagined. At the heart of this intellectual revolution stood Baghdad's House of Wisdom, a vast academy that became the beating heart of global learning. Within its walls, mathematicians explored the patterns of infinity. Astronomers charted the heavens with precision that would not be matched in Europe for centuries. Physicians studied the human body as a divine mystery, guided by both faith and reason. It was in this world that Muhammad ibn Musa al-Khwarizmi gave birth to algebra, al-Jabr, and devised the algorithms that would one day power modern computation. Astronomers like al-Battani refined planetary models with near mathematical perfection, while Ibn Sina, or Avicenna, composed the Canon of Medicine, a work so advanced that it remained Europe's leading medical text for over 500 years. And beyond the scientific, a philosophy of balance flourished. Knowledge was not separate from faith, it was a form of worship, and to study creation was to understand the Creator. This spirit of curiosity transformed the Islamic Golden Age into one of the most radiant periods in human history, a time when the pursuit of truth transcended religion, nationality, and race. But as centuries passed, much of this brilliance began to fade from Western memory. When the Crusades erupted, cultural exchange turned to conflict. The bridge of learning between East and West began to crumble. And when Europe finally reawakened during the Renaissance, it told a story of rediscovery, one that conveniently forgot who had preserved the very treasures it now celebrated. Yet the truth remains, etched in manuscripts scattered across the Middle East and Spain, Latin translations of Arabic works copied line by line, word by word, by European monks and scholars. Without these texts, there would be no Copernicus, no Galileo, no Da Vinci. The spark of the Renaissance was ignited by the embers of Islamic genius. Today, historians are slowly unearthing this forgotten connection, a truth long buried under centuries of bias and silence. The so-called Dark Ages of Europe were illuminated by the golden brilliance of the Arabic world. The story of civilization, it turns out, was never divided between East and West. It was a single shared journey. And as Europe slept beneath the weight of dogma and fear, the Islamic world carried the torch of reason, ensuring that humanity's light never truly went out. In a world still shrouded by superstition and conquest, there once stood a city that dared to dream of something greater, not wealth, not power, but knowledge itself. That city was Baghdad, the jewel of the Abbasid Caliphate, where the scent of ink was more valuable than gold, and the whisper of ideas could travel farther than armies. At its heart stood a sanctuary unlike any the world had ever seen. Bait al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom. Founded in the 8th century under Caliph al-Mamun, it was not a temple of worship, but of understanding. Within its walls, the finest minds from every corner of the known world, Arabs, Persians, Greeks, Jews, and Christians, gathered under a single belief, that truth belongs to all of humanity. Here, beneath the golden dome of Baghdad, scholars translated the works of Aristotle, Archimedes, and Hippocrates from Greek into Arabic. But they did not stop there. They challenged, refined, and expanded upon them, transforming ancient fragments into new foundations. What emerged was not mere preservation, but evolution. Mathematicians like al-Khwarizmi crafted the language of algebra, giving birth to the very concept of the algorithm, the invisible thread that now powers our digital world. Astronomers mapped the stars with instruments of breathtaking precision, building upon the Greek astrolabe to chart celestial movements and time itself. Physicians such as Hunayn ibn Ishaq compiled vast medical encyclopedias, bridging Greek theory with practical experimentation. Chemists like Jabir ibn Hayyan laid the groundwork for modern chemistry, transforming mystical alchemy into measurable science. The House of Wisdom became the first true research institute, a living engine of discovery. Its scholars studied mathematics beside poetry, astronomy beside philosophy, medicine beside metaphysics. It was a world where knowledge had no borders, and truth had no single language. And yet the greatest power of the House of Wisdom was not in its books, but in its spirit. It embodied an idea revolutionary even today, that faith and reason could coexist, that to understand creation was to honor the Creator. In Baghdad's bustling markets and lecture halls, debates would echo late into the night. Philosophers questioned the nature of reality. Mathematicians pondered infinity. Paper, imported from China, allowed ideas to spread faster than ever before, turning Baghdad into the printing press of the ancient world. From here, knowledge radiated outward, carried by traders, travelers, and scholars. It crossed deserts into North Africa, sailed across the Mediterranean to Spain, and through translation, eventually reached medieval Europe. Unbeknownst to most, this knowledge would one day ignite the Renaissance, centuries before Europe even knew it was sleeping. But like all golden ages, this too was fragile. In 1258, the Mongols stormed Baghdad. As their armies tore through the city, they cast the precious manuscripts of the House of Wisdom into the Tigris. Witnesses claimed the river ran black with ink for days. The greatest repository of human thought was lost. But its ideas had already taken flight. The House of Wisdom may have fallen, but its legacy endured. Every equation, every chart, every cure that emerged from its scholars became part of humanity's shared inheritance. And so, in the heart of ancient Baghdad, a truth was written. That knowledge, once awakened, can never truly die. For centuries, the House of Wisdom stood as a silent reminder that the real center of the world is not a place of power or empire, but wherever human curiosity dares to ask, why? They called themselves the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, but history would come to know them by a far simpler name, the Knights Templar. To the world, they were warriors of faith, noble defenders of pilgrims on the road to Jerusalem. Yet behind their vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience lay something far more enigmatic, a purpose hidden beneath centuries of devotion and silence. When the Templars arrived in the Holy Land in the early 12th century, they took residence upon a site that pulsed with ancient power. The Temple Mount, once home to Solomon's temple, the very heart of biblical legend. Officially, they were tasked with guarding Christian travelers, but for nearly a decade, they did not fight. Instead, they dug. Beneath the temple's ruins, through layers of history long buried, they searched for something lost to time, something sacred. What they found there would forever alter their destiny. Though no records survive to tell us precisely what the Templars unearthed, legends abound, relics of unimaginable power, scrolls written in forgotten tongues, or perhaps the hidden sciences of the ancients. Some whispered that they discovered the Ark of the Covenant, others that they found the true Holy Grail. Not a cup, but a form of divine knowledge, the key to creation itself. When the Templars emerged from beneath the Temple Mount, they were no longer humble knights. Within a generation, they became one of the most powerful organizations in Europe. Their symbol, the red cross on white, came to represent both purity and sacrifice. But behind that symbol there was secrecy. The order amassed vast wealth, built fortresses across continents, and developed a network of coded communication that stretched from Scotland to Jerusalem. More mysteriously still, they began to demonstrate an understanding of architecture, mathematics, the astronomy far beyond the norms of their age. Their churches were aligned with celestial patterns. Their cathedrals echoed with geometric precision and sacred proportion. It was as if they carried within them a blueprint from an older world, knowledge that did not belong to the Middle Ages. Kings borrowed money from them. Popes sought their blessing, yet as their influence grew, so did fear. Rumors spread that their rituals invoked forbidden names, that their worship was not of the cross, but of something older. Whispers of heresy echoed through the halls of power. By the early 14th century, their enemies struck. On Friday, October the 13th, 1307, King Philip IV of France, deep in debt to the order, conspired with Pope Clement V. At dawn, the Templars were arrested across Europe. Tortured confessions were extracted, and the once revered knights were branded as heretics. Their Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, was burned at the stake. But as the flames rose, he cursed both king and pope, and vowed that their lineages would soon fall. Within a year, both men were dead. Yet the deeper mystery endured. When the royal soldiers stormed the Templar stronghold in Paris, the greatest treasure of the order, their archives, their relics, their knowledge, was gone, vanished without a trace. Some say the Templars fled with it to Scotland, others to Portugal, where they re-emerged under new names. A few even claim they sailed west across the Atlantic, centuries before Columbus, carrying their sacred secret to a new world. Whatever truth lies buried beneath their legend, one thing remains certain. The Knights Templar were not merely warriors of faith. They were guardians of knowledge, protectors of something so profound, so dangerous, that kings feared it, and the Church sought to erase it. But knowledge, once awakened, cannot be destroyed. It hides, waiting for the right moment to be rediscovered. And perhaps, somewhere beneath the ruins of time, the Templar secret still endures, silent, patient, eternal. In the shadowed corners of history, long after the last pharaoh's tomb was sealed, a whisper continued to echo, a whisper of an ancient code, a divine science said to govern the very fabric of the universe. Those who guarded this wisdom called it Hermetic knowledge, and those who followed it became the silent inheritors of Egypt's lost light, the Hermetic Brotherhood. It is said that deep beneath the sands of Egypt, in the time before recorded history, priest scholars once studied the heavens not as God's domain, but as a living mechanism, a cosmic engine built upon geometry, proportion, and vibration. They believed that the divine was not distant, but woven into every line, angle, and rhythm of creation. This idea, known as above, so below, became the cornerstone of the Hermetic tradition, a bridge between heaven and earth, spirit and science. When Egypt fell, its temples crumbled and its knowledge scattered. but fragments of that ancient code survived, hidden within scrolls and cryptic texts carried across the Mediterranean. In the heart of Alexandria, centuries before its burning, philosophers and mystics translated these fragments into Greek. They called their teacher Hermes Trismegistus, thrice great Hermes, a figure who was part god, part sage, and perhaps part myth. The writings attributed to him, the Hermetica, spoke of the secret architecture of reality, the harmony of numbers, the sacred geometry of life, and the unseen energy binding all things. These were not mere metaphors. They described principles that later inspired alchemists, astronomers, and mathematicians. But when dogma began to rule Europe, such ideas were branded dangerous. The Church saw them as blasphemy, a threat to divine authority. And so the Hermetic manuscripts vanished into obscurity, protected by secret societies that arose in silence. Among them were groups that would one day become the stuff of legend, the Rosicrucians, the alchemists, and even early branches of the Freemasons. Within candlelit chambers, they studied the sacred proportions of the pyramids, the mathematics of the stars, and the mysteries of light. To them, Egypt was not dead. It was encoded, waiting to be read by those with eyes to see. Their symbols, the eye within the triangle, the serpent devouring its tail, the compass and the square, all echoed ancient Egyptian motifs. These were not emblems of power, but of balance, the merging of heaven and earth, matter and spirit, science and faith. The Brotherhood believed that the universe spoke through pattern, and that by understanding those patterns, one could glimpse the mind of the Creator. Throughout the Renaissance, whispers of this ancient knowledge began to reappear. Scholars such as Marsilio Ficino and Giordano Bruno rediscovered the Hermetica and dared to interpret them. Bruno, who claimed the stars were suns surrounded by worlds, was burned alive for his vision. But his ideas, and the ancient wisdom behind them, refused to die. Even today, traces of this lost Egyptian code linger in the blueprints of cathedrals, in the geometry of sacred art, and in the hidden mathematics of life itself. It is there, in the spiral of a seashell, the orbit of a planet, the structure of a galaxy, a pattern that repeats endlessly, as if whispering a truth humanity once knew by heart. The Hermetic Brotherhood may have vanished from the world's stage, but their purpose endures: to seek the unity of all knowledge, to understand that the divine is not beyond us, but within the geometry of existence itself. For those who listen closely enough, the ancient voice of Hermes still speaks. Across time, across faiths, across civilizations, reminding us that creation itself is a code waiting to be remembered. In the heart of medieval Europe, beneath cathedral spires and golden mosaics, a quiet war was being waged. Not with swords or soldiers, but with silence. It was a war for the human mind, for the right to define truth itself. After the fall of Rome, chaos reigned, and amid the ruins, the Church rose as the one unshakable power. It promised order, salvation, and the light of faith, yet in doing so, it dimmed another flame, the flame of knowledge. For in knowledge lay questions, and in questions, the seeds of rebellion. The Church understood something profound, that whoever controls history controls destiny. And so, across centuries, knowledge was not merely forgotten, it was managed, filtered, and redefined. Ancient texts once studied freely by scholars were locked away in monasteries or quietly destroyed. Libraries that had survived the fall of empires were emptied in the name of purity. The very timeline of history was rewritten to center around divine creation, aligning every moment of the past with the will of heaven. To question this order was heresy, and heresy meant death. From the ashes of the old world, a new narrative emerged. One where faith ruled reason, where miracles replaced mathematics, and where obedience became the highest virtue. Yet hidden in that silence, fragments of the old world endured, preserved by those who refused to let the ancient light die. In the shadowed halls of monasteries, a few monks copied forbidden texts by hand, Aristotle, Euclid, and Galen, concealing them beneath layers of commentary that would appease their superiors. To the untrained eye, they were works of devotion, but to those who looked deeper, they were acts of quiet defiance. Meanwhile, in places like Spain and Sicily, crossroads between Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, knowledge flowed in secret channels. Translators worked by candlelight, converting Arabic manuscripts back into Latin, smuggling the brilliance of the East into Europe's darkened heart. These scholars risked everything, not for wealth or fame, but for the survival of truth itself. The Church's power, however, was absolute. Through the Inquisition, it created a machinery of fear, rooting out anyone who dared to think differently. Astronomers who studied the stars, alchemists who experimented with matter, healers who used herbs, all faced the same accusation: witchcraft, heresy, rebellion against God. The flame that once burned in the temples of Alexandria and the observatories of Baghdad now flickered in hidden rooms and secret brotherhoods. And yet, this suppression had an unintended consequence. The more knowledge was forbidden, the more sacred it became. The human spirit, curious and unyielding, turned secrecy into survival. Scholars met in hidden gatherings. Books were copied in cipher. Ideas traveled disguised as symbols and allegories. A silent network of seekers emerged across Europe, protectors of the light in an age of darkness. In time, even within the Church's own walls, cracks began to form. Some among the clergy could not ignore the questions anymore. If God had created the universe, why should understanding his creation be a sin? Why should truth fear discovery? These questions would one day ignite revolutions, in science, in art, and in faith itself. But in these early centuries, they lived quietly in whispers, hidden behind the very walls that sought to silence them. The Church's war on knowledge was not just a battle for control, it was a battle for the soul of humanity, a struggle between fear and curiosity, between faith and freedom. And though the Church may have won the battles, it could never win the war, for truth, like light, cannot be contained. No matter how deep the darkness, there is always someone who remembers the flame. In a world where words could condemn and parchment could burn, there existed a second history, one written not in cathedrals, but in shadows. It was a history of forbidden manuscripts, quietly copied by trembling hands, hidden beneath monastery floors, sealed behind false walls, or buried in clay jars far from the eyes of inquisitors. These were the books that defied the Church, relics of a forgotten age when truth was measured not by faith, but by discovery. They spoke of atoms and stars, of the movement of the earth, of healing herbs and unseen forces. To the scholars who preserved them, they were sacred, but to the powers of the time, they were dangerous. The story begins in the candle-lit corridors of medieval Europe. By day, monks chanted hymns to God. By night, some of them became silent guardians of wisdom far older than Christianity itself. They translated and recopied fragments of Aristotle, Ptolemy, and Galen, embedding pagan science within the comforting framework of faith. A single margin note, a hidden symbol, or an unusual choice of word, was often the difference between salvation and the stake. But these manuscripts were not only Greek. Some came from faraway lands, from Baghdad's House of Wisdom, from Alexandria's fading memory, and from ancient Egypt's tombs. They were texts smuggled across deserts and seas, carried by traders, scholars, and wanderers who risked everything to keep the light of reason alive. In one such manuscript, the works of Hermes Trismegistus, a mysterious synthesis of Greek and Egyptian thought, whispered of a universe connected through divine geometry, a code that revealed harmony between heaven and earth. Others contained the teachings of alchemists who claimed matter itself was alive with spiritual energy, and that transformation, the heart of alchemy, was not just metal into gold, but ignorance into understanding to the church. These ideas threatened its authority. For if man could comprehend the laws of creation, then perhaps he no longer needed permission to seek the Creator. And so, the Inquisition sharpened its quills and its blades. Book by book, the flames rose. Yet still, the manuscripts survived. They passed from scholar to scholar, whispered from one generation to the next. Some hid within the libraries of Moorish Spain, disguised under Islamic names. Others reappeared centuries later in the hands of Renaissance thinkers who dared to bring them once more into the light. Each manuscript was a rebellion, a testament to the defiance of thought. The margins of these texts carried not just ink, but fingerprints of courage. Within them, we find the birth of the scientific method, the foundations of modern medicine, and the spark that would ignite the age of enlightenment. The Church may have silenced voices, but it could never erase the written word. The manuscripts, though scattered and damaged, became immortal, surviving not because of armies or empires, but because a few souls believed that truth was worth the risk. And as centuries turned, the hidden words of those secret books began to resurface. They revealed that the so-called Dark Ages were never truly dark. They were dimly lit by the brave, by those who chose the pen over the sword and the candle over the cross. Every lost page, every fragile parchment, is a reminder. Knowledge cannot be destroyed, only delayed. For truth waits patiently in the shadows until the world is ready to listen again. There was a time when the world slept, when Europe's cathedrals echoed with prayers but not with questions, and curiosity was treated as a threat. Yet far to the east, beyond the deserts and the rising sun, a new light began to glow. It was not the light of conquest nor of wealth, but of understanding. This was the Golden Age of Islam, an era when the human mind, freed by faith, reached for the stars. From the 8th to the 13th century, the Islamic world became the beating heart of global knowledge. In cities like Baghdad, Damascus, Cordoba, and Samarkand, science, art, and philosophy thrived in ways the West could scarcely imagine. These cities were not merely centers of religion, they were living universities, where scholars debated under the open sky, where the call to prayer harmonized with the hum of discovery. Here, faith and reason were not enemies. The Quran itself urged believers to seek knowledge, to study the universe as a reflection of divine order. This belief ignited a movement that transformed the ancient wisdom of Greece, Persia, India, and Egypt into a new, unified vision of reality. Astronomers charted the heavens with instruments more precise than anything seen before. They mapped the motion of planets, calculated the circumference of the Earth, and even theorized about gravity, centuries before Newton. In medicine, visionaries like Al-Razi and Ibn Sina, Avicenna, wrote vast encyclopedias that blended observation with experimentation, treating illness as a natural, not mystical phenomenon. Their books would later become the cornerstone of European medicine. Mathematicians such as Al-Khwarizmi introduced algebra, algebra, and gave birth to the numerical systems that underpin the modern world. Chemists like Jabir ibn Hayyan transformed alchemy into a true science, inventing processes still used in laboratories today. Even in the arts, geometry and astronomy shaped architecture, giving rise to mosques whose domes and patterns reflected the order of the cosmos itself. But perhaps the most remarkable achievement of all was the spirit of tolerance that made this flourishing possible. In the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, Muslim, Christian, and Jewish scholars worked side by side, united by curiosity rather than creed. They translated Aristotle and Plato into Arabic, preserved them through centuries of turmoil, and expanded upon them with insights of their own. While much of Europe labeled this era a dark age, the Islamic world was illuminating the path toward modernity. Paper, imported from China, revolutionized learning, allowing libraries to swell with hundreds of thousands of manuscripts. Knowledge spread along the Silk Road, crossing deserts and oceans, carried by travelers who saw no boundary between science and the sacred. Yet, as history often reminds us, golden ages are fragile. The Mongol invasions, the fall of Baghdad, and later internal divisions dimmed the flame that had once burned so brightly. The torch of knowledge would pass westward, into the hands of those who would call it the Renaissance, though few would remember where it truly began. Still, the legacy of that era remains everywhere we look, in the numbers we use, the medicine we practice, the stars we name, and the architecture that still stands. The Golden Age of Islam was not just a chapter in history. It was a revelation, a moment when humanity remembered that faith and reason could exist not as rivals, but as reflections of the same divine mystery. And though the empires have fallen and the libraries turned to dust, the light they lit never died. For the world awoke once, and in that awakening it discovered not just knowledge but itself. In the heart of the 9th century, when the sands of Baghdad shimmered beneath the golden sun, a quiet revolution was unfolding, not on the battlefield, but on parchment. It was led not by a warrior, but by a scholar whose pen would forever change the language of science, navigation, and thought itself. His name was Muhammad ibn Musa al-Khwarizmi, and his discovery would rewrite the rules of human understanding. At a time when Europe still wrestled with the remnants of Rome's collapse, the Islamic world was thriving in its golden age of learning. Baghdad's House of Wisdom stood as a beacon of intellectual light, a sanctuary where scholars from every faith gathered to translate, debate, and expand upon the ancient works of Greece, India, and Persia. Within these walls, al-Khwarizmi immersed himself in the mysteries of numbers, symbols that had long fascinated humanity, but had never been truly understood. Before him, the world relied on the cumbersome Roman numerals, a system fit for counting coins, but useless for the growing complexities of astronomy, architecture, and trade. From ancient India, al-Khwarizmi encountered something revolutionary, a new numerical framework that introduced the concept of zero, a symbol for nothingness that paradoxically gave rise to infinite possibility. To al-Khwarizmi, zero was not an absence, but a foundation. It represented balance, the unseen center from which all quantities could emerge. This understanding was more than mathematics. It was philosophy, a reflection of the divine symmetry that governed both the heavens and the human soul. In his groundbreaking text, Kitab al-Jabr wal-Muqabala, al-Khwarizmi introduced the world to al-Jabr, or restoration, the very root of what we now call algebra. His methods allowed unknowns to be revealed, patterns to be predicted, and nature's hidden laws to be expressed through pure reason. In essence, he gave humanity a universal language, one capable of describing the invisible structures of existence itself. But his work did not end there. Al-Khwarizmi also refined geographical measurements, created advanced astronomical tables, and helped develop the concept of algorithms, a word derived directly from his name. Every calculation made by a computer, every digital sequence, every encoded message, all trace their lineage back to this quiet scholar who lived 1,000 years ago. What al-Khwarizmi achieved was more than scientific progress. It was a shift in consciousness. Numbers were no longer mere tools for merchants and scribes. They became the blueprint of creation, symbols capable of unlocking the architecture of the cosmos. His synthesis of Indian, Persian, and Greek ideas embodied the very spirit of the Islamic Golden Age, a bridge between worlds, a dialogue between civilizations. When his works were later translated into Latin, Europe began to awaken. His name, distorted into algorithmy, became the root of the word algorithm, and his algebra gave birth to the entire field of algebra. Yet, as centuries passed, his true origins were buried under layers of Western appropriation. His brilliance lived on, but his name faded into the margins of history. Today, Al-Khwarizmi's influence is everywhere. In the binary code that powers modern computers, in the equations that guide rockets to the stars, in the invisible logic that shapes our digital world. His legacy reminds us that knowledge knows no borders, that the language of numbers is the language of humanity itself. And so, the man from Khwarezm, the scholar who found order in nothingness, continues to speak to us through every equation written, every calculation made, every algorithm that defines our age. From zero, he gave us infinity. And in doing so, he proved that even in the silence of nothing, the universe whispers the secrets of everything. In the heart of the Persian Empire, a young boy wandered through ancient libraries, his eyes reflecting the flicker of oil lamps illuminating countless manuscripts. His name was Ibn Sina, known to the West as Avicenna, and though he lived over 1,000 years ago, his understanding of the human body and mind still echoes through modern medicine. Born in 980 CE in the city of Afshana, near Bukhara, Ibn Sina was a child of wonder. By the age of 10, he had memorized the Quran. By 16, he was already a practicing physician. Yet his curiosity was not driven by fame or fortune. It was driven by a deeper question. What does it truly mean to heal? In an era when Europe still explained illness as divine punishment or witchcraft, Ibn Sina approached medicine as both a science and an art. He believed the body was a reflection of the cosmos, that the same harmony governing the stars also governed our flesh and blood. To him, healing meant restoring that balance. His greatest work, Al-Qanun fi al-Tib, the Canon of Medicine, became a masterpiece of human intellect. Written in 5 volumes, it unified centuries of knowledge from Greek, Indian, Persian, and Islamic traditions into one coherent system. He described the anatomy of organs, the nature of diseases, the role of the mind in health, and the power of observation in diagnosis. For nearly 700 years, the canon remained the cornerstone of medical education across both East and West. Within its pages, Ibn Sina defined over 760 drugs, explained contagion centuries before germ theory, and even proposed experimental methods for testing the effectiveness of treatments. He emphasized hygiene, mental well-being, and the idea that prevention was better than cure, ideas that would not fully take hold in Europe until the modern age. But beyond his science, Ibn Sina's philosophy was profound. He believed that the physician must heal not only the body, but the soul. In his writings, he spoke of the deep connection between emotion and illness, how sadness could weaken the heart, and how joy could restore it. To him, every patient was a universe in miniature, deserving both compassion and understanding. The legacy of Ibn Sina extended far beyond hospitals and clinics. His ideas traveled through time, influencing generations of doctors, scholars, and thinkers. When the canon of medicine was translated into Latin in the 12th century, it transformed Europe's understanding of health. For centuries, it was studied in universities from Bologna to Paris, revered as the ultimate authority on medicine. But like so many figures from the Islamic Golden Age, his name was gradually overshadowed. His discoveries remained, but the world forgot who had first articulated them. Today, every time a doctor uses the scientific method, every time a diagnosis relies on observation, every time a healer seeks the root cause instead of the symptom, Ibn Sina's spirit is alive. He taught that medicine was not merely the repair of the body, but the understanding of life itself, that every cure begins with knowledge, and every physician's true duty is to seek harmony between the physical, the mental, and the spiritual. A millennium later, in hospitals and laboratories across the globe, his words still resonate like an eternal heartbeat of wisdom. Ibn Sina, the man who once walked beneath the stars of Persia, reached beyond his time to remind humanity of an enduring truth, that healing begins with understanding, and understanding begins with wonder. In the shimmering deserts of Basra, beneath the blazing sun of the 10th century, a man stood gazing into the distance, not at the horizon, but through it. His name was Ibn al-Haytham, known to the Latin world as Al-Hawzen, and his vision would forever change how humanity saw the world, quite literally. At a time when superstition ruled perception, when philosophers believed that the eyes emitted rays to grasp the world around them, Ibn al-Haytham dared to ask a simple yet revolutionary question. What if it's the light that enters us, not the other way around? Born in 965 CE in Basra, he lived in an era of dazzling intellect, a time when Baghdad's House of Wisdom echoed with the murmurs of mathematicians, astronomers, and physicians. But Ibn al-Haytham's obsession was light itself, that mysterious force that revealed the universe but could never be touched. He built his life around experimentation. When others debated endlessly in words, he tested, he observed, measured, and proved. Using darkened rooms, mirrors, and lenses, he unraveled the secrets of vision. His famous book of optics, Kitab al-Manazir, would become one of the most influential scientific works ever written. In his experiments, he discovered that light travels in straight lines and that the eye perceives objects because light reflects off them and enters the eye, a truth that seems simple today, but overturned centuries of belief. He explored the behavior of lenses, the laws of reflection and refraction, and even described the structure of the eye with remarkable accuracy. But Ibn al-Haytham's genius extended beyond optics. He pioneered a way of thinking that would shape all of science. He wrote, "The duty of the man who investigates the writings of scientists, if learning the truth is his goal, is to make himself an enemy of all that he reads." He meant that knowledge must not be accepted blindly. It must be tested, questioned, and verified. This was the birth of the scientific method, centuries before Galileo and Newton. In the dim glow of his lamplit workshop, Ibn al-Haytham transformed curiosity into a system, experiment, observation, and evidence. For the first time, science was not about belief, but about proof. His discoveries reached far beyond the Islamic world. When his writings were translated into Latin in the 12th century, they ignited the European Renaissance. Artists like Leonardo da Vinci studied his work to understand light and perspective. Scientists like Kepler and Descartes built upon his theories to unlock the secrets of optics and vision. Every telescope, every camera lens, every microscope, all trace their lineage back to his insight. Yet, Ibn al-Haytham's life was not without struggle. When he challenged the caliph's engineering projects along the Nile, he was imprisoned, forced to feign madness to save his life. But even in confinement, he continued to write, to think, and to experiment. His cell became his laboratory. His mind remained free. He believed that truth was a divine pursuit, that to study light was to study the essence of creation itself. In every ray that entered his chamber, he saw not just illumination, but revelation, a glimpse of the cosmic order woven through existence. Today, as satellites orbit the Earth and telescopes peer into galaxies billions of light-years away, their vision owes a debt to a scholar who once sat alone in a darkened room, tracing the path of light through a pinhole. Ibn al-Haytham did not merely teach us how to see, he taught us why to look. He reminded humanity that knowledge is not born of faith or fear, but of wonder and persistence. And in every beam of light that cuts through shadow, his spirit endures, the man who turned vision into science and darkness into understanding. Long before Columbus set sail across the Atlantic, long before the age of discovery even had a name, there existed maps, ancient, mysterious, and impossibly accurate, that hinted at a world far older and far more connected than history admits. These were not crude sketches born of sailors' tales, They were precise, detailed depictions of coastlines, some drawn centuries before anyone from Europe was supposed to have seen them. Among the most famous is the Piri race map, created in 1513 by an Ottoman admiral who claimed his work was based on sources from the time of Alexander the Great. When scholars studied the map, what they found defied reason. It showed parts of South America in remarkable detail, its contours matching satellite measurements made centuries later. Even more astonishing, at the map's southern edge lay the coastline of Antarctica, drawn without its modern ice cover. A frozen continent accurately depicted 500 years before it was officially discovered, and perhaps thousands before modern science knew its shape beneath the ice. How could this be possible? Who charted lands no European explorer had yet reached? Piri Reis himself gave a clue. In his notes, he mentioned using ancient charts, passed down through generations, some dating back to long-lost civilizations. These maps, he claimed, came from men who sailed the 7 seas long before our time. The more historians searched, the deeper the mystery grew. Other maps, like the Orontius Phineus map and the Buache map, also showed Antarctica's hidden coastlines and accurate representations of the Pacific and Atlantic. It was as if fragments of a forgotten global knowledge had somehow survived the collapse of empires and the passage of centuries. Some theorists whisper that these charts might trace their origins to the Library of Alexandria, or perhaps to even older sources, civilized irons that mastered navigation long before the compass, perhaps even before the rise of recorded history. The idea suggests that the age of discovery was not an awakening, but a rediscovery. A moment when ancient wisdom, scattered and hidden, re-emerged in the hands of new explorers. When Columbus embarked on his voyage in 1492, he carried with him maps that hinted at land to the west. Some of these, scholars believe, may have been copies of those same ancient charts, drawn by unknown hands from forgotten ages. And what if this knowledge was never truly lost, but protected? Passed through secret networks of scholars, preserved by Templars, monks and mapmakers who understood that to control knowledge was to control destiny. The outlines of continents, the routes of winds and currents, they were not just geographical facts. They were power. These maps challenge the very timeline of exploration. They whisper of a past when humans may have known far more of their world than we imagine. When seafarers could cross oceans long before the sails of Spain and Portugal filled the horizon. Perhaps the true age of discovery did not begin in the 15th century. It ended there. It marked the closing chapter of a much older story, one that began with ancient navigators who mapped the stars, followed the winds, and left behind faint traces of their voyages in ink and parchment. Today, as satellites orbit our planet, we map the Earth with precision beyond imagination. Yet the enigma of those ancient charts remains, a reminder that history is not always written by the first who arrive, but by the last who remember. In the mysterious lines and forgotten coastlines of the Piri race map lies a quiet revelation, that humanity's true story of discovery stretches back far beyond Columbus, perhaps to a time when the world was already known and then deliberately forgotten. In the heart of the dense jungles of Mesoamerica, beneath centuries of vines, roots, and silence, lie the remains of a civilization that mapped the heavens with astonishing precision, the Maya. To the outside world, they were ancient astronomers, temple builders, and mystics. But within their hidden codices, those delicate books of bark and ink, they preserved a knowledge of time and the stars that continues to baffle even modern science. When the Spanish conquistadors arrived in the 16th century, they saw not wisdom, but heresy. Thousands of Maya manuscripts, the codices, were gathered and burned in great pyres by the order of the Church. Only 4 are known to have survived. The rest, countless volumes of cosmic understanding, mathematics, and cyclical time, were turned to ash, their knowledge scattered into the wind. Yet the few that escaped tell a haunting story. In the Dresden Codex, The Maya charted the movements of Venus with such accuracy that modern astronomers were left stunned. Their calculations of the planet's cycles were precise to within seconds, an achievement unmatched anywhere else in the ancient world. To the Maya, Venus was not just a planet. It was the heartbeat of time itself, a celestial rhythm that guided the fates of kings and empires. But their astronomy went deeper still. The Maya believed the universe was born from a vast cosmic tree, a living axis that connected the heavens, earth, and the underworld. Their pyramids, such as those at Chichen Itza and Copan, were not just monuments of stone, but celestial instruments. On the equinoxes, sunlight aligned perfectly with serpent carvings, making it seem as though divine serpents slithered down the steps of their temples, a cosmic dance between the sun and the earth. How did they know so much? Some scholars believe the Maya inherited fragments of even older astronomical traditions, remnants of a knowledge system that may have stretched back to lost civilizations of antiquity. Others suggest their deep observation of the skies, across generations, led them to truths that science would only rediscover millennia later. But among the ruins and glyphs, there are hints of something more, a belief that their knowledge was not discovered, but given. The Popol Vuh, their sacred creation text, speaks of beings who came from the stars, shining ones, who bestowed wisdom upon humankind. To the conquistadors, these were myths, but to the Maya, they were history. What if the codices held more than just astronomical records? What if within their pages lay instructions, blueprints for understanding time as a cycle, not a line, a truth that challenges our entire perception of history? The destruction of those texts was not just an act of conquest. It was the silencing of a voice that spoke of the stars, the soul, and the hidden order of the cosmos. The flames that devoured the codices did more than erase a culture's memory. They burned away a piece of humanity's collective understanding of the universe. And yet, the echoes endure. Modern researchers have begun to decode surviving fragments, revealing patterns that link Maya calendars to celestial events with eerie precision. Their long count calendar, once misinterpreted as a doomsday prophecy, may instead represent a grand cosmic reset, the renewal of worlds in endless cycles. The Maya understood that time was alive, that the heavens and the earth were reflections of each other, and that the story of humanity was written not in ink, but in stars. Perhaps the true mystery of the Maya lies not in what they built, but in what they remembered. Their codices were not lost books, they were lost worlds, and somewhere beneath the jungle canopy, perhaps a few still wait, waiting for the day the world is ready to remember the knowledge the Maya once carried from the stars. The story of the Renaissance is one of humanity's proudest tales, the grand rebirth of art, science, and reason after centuries of darkness. We are told it began in the streets of Florence and Venice, where visionaries like Leonardo, Michelangelo, and Galileo reignited the flame of knowledge. But what if this light did not spark from nothing? What if the Renaissance was not a miracle of Europe, but a legacy borrowed, inherited, and reborn from civilizations the West once chose to forget? As Europe stumbled through the so-called Dark Ages, the East blazed with enlightenment. In Baghdad's House of Wisdom, scholars translated and preserved the works of Aristotle, Ptolemy, and Archimedes, while Europe burned their memory. In Cordoba and Toledo, Muslim, Jewish, and Christian thinkers sat together, decoding the mysteries of mathematics, medicine, and the stars. It was there that the old wisdom of Greece was reborn, in Arabic. The flow of knowledge did not move in secret. It traveled across deserts and seas, along the silk roads of exchange, carried in manuscripts, whispered in trade, hidden in the minds of scholars. When the Crusaders returned from the East, They did not bring only relics and gold. They brought books, and those books carried the seeds of the Renaissance. The mathematician Al-Khwarizmi, whose works introduced algebra to the world, had already reshaped how humans measured reality. His name would become algorithm, the foundation of modern computation. The astronomer Ibn al-Haytham had already uncovered the true nature of light and vision, centuries before Da Vinci ever sketched the human eye. The physician Ibn Sina had described the circulatory system and surgical techniques still studied in European universities long after his death. Yet as the Renaissance unfolded, these origins were quietly erased. The Arabic names were Latinized, their lineage obscure, read, their heritage forgotten. Progress was reborn, but its parents were left unnamed. And beyond the Islamic world, other sparks of genius flickered unseen. In China, engineers crafted mechanical clocks, printing presses, and magnetic compasses centuries before Gutenberg and Galileo. In India, mathematicians defined the concept of zero, a symbol that would reshape every equation in Europe. In Africa, the libraries of Timbuktu held thousands of manuscripts on astronomy, law, and philosophy, a treasure of thought that rivaled Alexandria's lost glory. The Renaissance, in truth, was a gathering of scattered flames, a reunion of knowledge that had survived in exile. Europe's rebirth was made possible because the East had kept the fire alive. But as history was rewritten, pride replaced gratitude. The narrative of a Western awakening took root, a story that celebrated Europe's genius while silencing the voices that fed it. The truth was buried beneath centuries of nationalism and conquest. Yet if we look closer, the evidence remains everywhere. The architecture of Florence bears the geometry of the East. The Renaissance's obsession with alchemy and light traces back to Hermetic manuscripts preserved by Arab scholars. Even the astrolabes that guided explorers across oceans were perfected in Damascus and Cairo long before European ships set sail. Perhaps the Renaissance was not the rebirth of knowledge, but its return home, the closing of a long circle of preservation, translation, and rediscovery. And in that realization lies a deeper truth. Progress has never belonged to one people, one faith, or one land. Humanity's light has always been shared, passed hand to hand, century to century, across deserts, oceans, and empires. The Renaissance was not Europe's alone. It was Earth's, a global memory reawakening after an age of forgetting. History is more than memory. It is power. It decides who we celebrate, what we forget, and which truths are allowed to survive. But what happens when the story of the world is told not by those who lived it, but by those who conquered it? For centuries, history has been written by the victors, edited by empires, polished by priests, and rewritten by kings. Every book, every chronicle, every monument reflects not pure truth, but the ambitions of those who held the pen. The victors preserved their glory. The defeated were reduced to shadows. The Roman Empire, for instance, gave us the idea of civilization, but erased the voices of the tribes and kingdoms it crushed. The Church recorded the Dark Ages, but in doing so painted centuries of human resilience as stagnation. The conquistadors chronicled the New World, yet silenced the wisdom of the civilizations they destroyed. And the Renaissance, celebrated as Europe's rebirth, conveniently forgot the Eastern scholars, African libraries, and Arab astronomers who had carried the torch of knowledge through the dark. Every omission reshaped how we see ourselves. The word barbarian once described anyone who did not speak Greek or Latin, but over time it became a curse, erasing entire cultures from dignity. The term pagan dismissed the spiritual complexity of ancient Europe, Africa, and the Americas. Even maps were rewritten, shrinking the lands outside Europe's reach, as though geography itself bowed to empire. This rewriting of truth was not always a conspiracy. Often, it was a quiet evolution of power. When the Church rose, pagan libraries were burned. When colonizers came, indigenous histories were called myths. When science began to flourish, ancient technologies were dismissed as superstition. Yet through every era, one question lingers: what knowledge was lost, and what truths were buried on purpose? In the archives of the Vatican, sealed manuscripts whisper of forgotten gospels and suppressed discoveries. In the deserts of Egypt and the caves of Qumran, scrolls emerged that challenged accepted timelines. In the temples of the Maya, hieroglyphs revealed astronomical knowledge once thought impossible for primitive peoples. Everywhere, the same pattern repeats. History is curated, not remembered. But the victors did not just shape what we know, they shaped how we think. The idea of progress, of a single linear march toward modernity, is itself a creation of empire, a comforting illusion that places one civilization at the pinnacle of all others. Yet the truth is cyclical. Knowledge rises, falls, and rises again, carried by those who refuse to let it die. Today, we stand at a crossroads between the world we were told existed and the one that truly was. Archaeologists, linguists, and digital explorers are uncovering lost histories, rewriting what we thought we knew about humanity's past. We are learning that civilization did not move in a straight line, but in spirals, rising and collapsing across continents, connected by invisible threads of trade, faith, and shared curiosity. Perhaps the greatest omission in history is not what was erased, but what it means to be human, creative, fragile, and endlessly seeking. The story of our world is not the triumph of one people over another, but the collective memory of all who dared to dream, build, and remember. And so, as the victor's ink fades and the buried voices begin to rise once more, we find ourselves facing a profound revelation. The truth was never lost. It was only hidden, waiting for those willing to look beyond the official story. Because history, in the end, belongs not to the victors, but to those who continue to ask questions. Through every age of silence, every empire of control, and every century of forgetting, there have always been those who refuse to let the light die. Quiet figures, nameless in most records, who carried fragments of truth through the flames of history. They were not kings nor conquerors, but guardians, of memory, of wisdom, of the idea that knowledge itself is sacred. When the Library of Alexandria fell to fire, scholars fled with scrolls hidden beneath their robes. When Europe's monasteries sealed their gates, monks copied forbidden texts by candlelight, their ink the last lifeline between ancient and modern thought. When the Templars were hunted and burned, their knowledge vanished, but not entirely. It re-emerged, disguised in secret brotherhoods, preserved in symbols, geometry, and whispered rituals that outlived their persecutors. In the Islamic Golden Age, scientists safeguarded the works of Greece and Rome while adding discoveries of their own, not for empire or glory, but for truth. When the Mongols destroyed Baghdad, fragments of its wisdom survived, carried east to Persia, India, and China, woven into new schools of thought. In every age of darkness, someone, somewhere, protected a single spark. Even in the modern world, the guardians remain. They are archaeologists who dig where history told them not to, linguists decoding lost scripts, scientists questioning timelines, and ordinary seekers, people who feel that beneath the noise of official history, something greater hums, waiting to be heard again. Because knowledge, though it can be buried, cannot be destroyed. It moves like water, seeping through cracks, resurfacing in new forms, finding those who are ready to see. From ancient scrolls to encrypted data, from the stones of forgotten temples to the stars above us, truth endures in patterns that never fully disappear. Perhaps that is why the old Mai, the speak of fire stolen from the gods, not as a story of rebellion, but of responsibility. To carry knowledge is to guard light against the shadows of ignorance, and every time humanity forgets, someone, somewhere, begins to remember. Today, as technology reconnects the fragments of our shared past, we are witnessing that awakening again. Lost languages are being revived. Forbidden texts are being translated. Ancient technologies, Roman concrete, Greek fire, the precision of Inca stonework, are being rediscovered through science once more. The same light that flickered in Babylon, Alexandria, Baghdad, and Florence is glowing again, not in the hands of rulers, but in the minds of the curious. Perhaps that is the real secret, that the protectors were never chosen. They were simply those who cared enough to ask why, to look deeper, to see beyond the stories written for them. The truth does not belong to any one age or civilization. It belongs to the seekers, the ones who listen when the world falls silent, who follow whispers across centuries, who believe that every lost page, every broken ruin, and every unanswered question matters. Because in the end, history is not a straight line. It is a circle. The same light that once rose over the pyramids, the ziggurats, the temples, and the cathedrals still shines within us. And as we begin to remember what was forgotten, to reclaim what was hidden, we realize the guardians were never gone. They are us. As the echoes of history fade into silence, one truth endures. Humanity has never truly lived in darkness. Every age we called dark was only a moment between awakenings, a pause before the next light emerged. From the ruins of empires to the candlelit desks of monks, from hidden laboratories to the libraries of Baghdad, from the secret vaults of the Templars to the forgotten codices of the Maya, knowledge has always found its way back to the world. Because no matter how fiercely power tries to bury it, truth is patient. It waits. It survives in symbols, in stories, in the unshakable curiosity of those who dare to ask why. We've journeyed across centuries of silence, through the ashes of Alexandria, the hidden halls of Byzantium, the brilliance of Islamic scholars, and the courage of those who risked everything to protect the light of understanding. And now, that same light burns in us, the seekers of today, the new guardians of tomorrow. So as we close this chapter, remember, history is not just what was written. It's what remains to be rediscovered. And the greatest mysteries are never buried in time. They're hidden in plain sight, waiting for the curious to find them. If this journey moved you, if it made you question what you've been told, then don't let the flame fade. Join us. Like, share, and subscribe to Mysteries of Earth, and be part of a growing circle of thinkers, dreamers, and truth-seekers who believe the past still has more to say. Because every mystery we uncover brings us closer to understanding who we truly are, and how far the light of human knowledge can travel through the darkness of time.